Soy la isla Caribe, soy la raíz, el mar azul que te abraza, soy mi país. Y soy el oro invitándote a descubrir. Yo soy taíno, soy blanco, soy lucumí. Soy la isla Caribe, soy la raíz, el mar azul que te abraza, soy mi país. Y soy el oro invitándote a descubrir. Yo soy taíno, soy blanco, soy lucumí.
¡Arriba Caribe! Soy el alba de los sueños, la hoja de caracolillo que despiertan en la arena cuando danza el areíto. De Borinquen a Quisqueya, de La Habana y Yaracuy, luz de faro en cada puerto, como destino el mismo azul. Si hay clave de la rumba en el merengue y la tambora, si aquí son de guaguancó, te vas cruzando el río. Si respiran tus orillas, en el Caribe mestizo.
Caribe, soy la raíz, el mar azul que te abraza, soy mi país. Y soy el oro invitándote a descubrir. Yo soy taíno, soy blanco, soy lucumí. Soy la isla Caribe, soy la raíz, el mar azul que te abraza, soy mi país. Y soy el oro invitándote a descubrir. Yo soy taíno, soy blanco, soy lucumí.
¡Súbelo! Si hay clave de la rumba en el merengue y la tambora,
si aquí son de guaguancó, que vas cruzando el río.
Si respiran tus orillas en el Caribe mestizo.
No quiero un corazón, uno solo quiero yo. Un solo corazón en el Caribe quiero yo. Yo quiero un corazón, uno solo quiero yo. Un solo corazón en el Caribe quiero yo.
¡Vamos allá!
Yo quiero un corazón, uno solo quiero yo.
Sigue latiendo en el Caribe, un corazón es lo que te pido yo.
Yo quiero un corazón, uno solo quiero yo.
Un solo corazón, uno solo pido yo.
Yo quiero un corazón, uno solo quiero yo.
Tiburón que buscas en la orilla que se perdió.
Yo quiero un corazón,
que se perdió.
Uno solo quiero yo. Un solo corazón en el Caribe quiero yo.
¡Fuera! Buenos días, Caribe. Buenas noches, América. Buenos días, Caribe. Y llegará el día en que este mar mestizo latirá en un solo corazón de sueños y abrazos compartidos. Y no habrá fronteras, temores, egoísmo. Y nos fundiremos en un crisol de nuevos caminos.
Soy la isla Caribe, soy la raíz. El mar que te abraza, soy mi país. Y soy el oro invitándote a descubrir. Yo soy taíno, soy blanco, soy lucumí.
Greetings, everyone. That was Tierra Caribe, or Caribbean Earth, Caribbean land. A wonderful new song we wanted to share with you all tonight by Armando y su Talisman, celebrating the diversity of Cuba. It's Taino and Afro roots and Cuban culture. We will put the link in the chat, but thought that was a great way to set the tone for tonight's important discussion of course, about continued US government war and attacks on Cuba, especially through the use of media lies, disinformation, a concerted campaign to destabilize the Cuban Revolution and to support the criminal policy of US blockade against Cuba. My name is Allison Bodine. I am an organizer with Friends of Cuba against the US blockade Vancouver, and also the Fire This Time movement for social justice, where I'm on the editorial board of the Fire This Time newspaper. It is really a pleasure tonight to co-MC this evening's webinar with Julie Walensky from the Chicago-Cuba Coalition. Tonight, we are here to talk about escalating lies against Cuba with a really excellent panelist of speakers, which is completely bilingual. We have simultaneous translation, which we will post information about in the chat. But if you are listening to me in English, that is because you are listening to the English room and I am speaking English. At any time, if any of our speakers start speaking Spanish and you say, I want to listen to English again, you have to go to the translation function in Zoom, which is a globe icon at the bottom of your screen, or an option under the 3 dots if you're participating on your phone. And then you choose the language you want to be listening in, and the option to mute original audio is helpful. There will be instructions in the chat. I want to acknowledge that this event is broadcast from the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. As we defend Cuba's right to self-determination, we also stand with Indigenous nations and defend their right to self-determination. Tonight's webinar, Escalating Lies Against Cuba, is organized by the US-Cuba Normalization Conference Coalition. We'll talk about that more later in the program, but the International US-Cuba Normalization Conference Coalition is an international group of folks interested in working towards the full normalization of relations between the United States and Cuba, an end to the criminal blockade on Cuba, the return of Guantanamo Bay to Cuba, and to remove Cuba immediately from the list of so-called state sponsors of terrorism. This is a group in the majority featuring organizers from the United States and here in Canada, and has been working, especially throughout the pandemic, to raise awareness, build a more education campaign on important topics such as tonight. I've really enjoyed working together with our co-fighters in the United States, and it's a pleasure to be co-emceeing tonight with Julie Walensky from the Chicago-Cuba Coalition. I'll now pass the mic over to Julie to say hello from Chicago and share some words.
Well, thank you, Allison. It is a pleasure to be co-hosting this wonderful panel. As Allison, the idea for this panel came up in a meeting based on a discussion, realizing there's been an increase in the frequency of the lies and the manipulations about what's going on in Cuba, and it's all, meant to undermine Cuba's revolution and what they've achieved over the 60-some years. And we think that it's really our collective responsibility to respond to these lies. However, it's done through joining protests in the streets, caravans, getting resolutions passed in unions and city councils, local government bodies, organizing panel speak-outs and or participating in them. It's all important part of responding to these lies and breaking them down. In Chicago, we sent a letter to the editor in response to a Chicago Trib op-ed piece and in June. And the Chicago Trib is basically the largest daily in the Midwest. The op-ed pretty much the content of the editorial was supportive of engagement with Havana for the benefit of the Cuban people, but then the editorial went on to say that it would make, and I say in quotes, Havana think twice about allowing Beijing to exploit Cuba's proximity to the US coastline. And then it continued on with more of the same kind of regurgitation of lies that we've heard over and over again, political repression, so on and so forth. So we wrote this letter and it was published. And in 500 words or less, we basically kind of talked about the history of the lies, and most recently the Chinese spy base, and placed it in the context of US government's goal to overthrow and cripple the Cuban economy and the Cuban government, per the Mallory memo that I'm sure everyone is familiar with. We explained the history, the strong history of Cuba in both defending their revolution and their sovereignty, and standing up and remaining consistent to the principles of the revolution. We described the impact of the US blockade to the national economy, and we called for taking Cuba off of the state sponsor of terrorism list. So this is all to say that in the name of the truth, they don't get the final word. This is something that we need to keep on trying to get the truth out about Cuba and point, and get people to kind of understand and hear from Cubans what's going on in Cuba. So in the spirit of the truth, we've got some great speakers that I don't want to, that I think everybody wants to hear from. And I want to just say a few things in terms of the organization of this webinar. First of all, the speakers will talk, and then we'll have a few announcements, and then we'll open the floor up for questions and answers. We want you to post your questions either in the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, or if you are unable to access that, you can post it in the chat section. We are live streaming this session so they can be shared with Cubans. Native Cubans do not have access to Zoom because of the blockade. And so we think it's an important way of sharing and sharing what's going on in the Cuba Solidarity movement with our fellow fighters and compañeros in Cuba. So the recording will be available on Facebook on demand later. So I'm going to pass the microphone back to Allison, who will show us a few videos, I believe.
Yeah, exactly. Just as folks kind of continue joining us, we wanted to show a few more videos to set the context for today's discussion. So the first one, they're both from Belly of the Beast, which we will talk with Liz, Oliva Fernández from Belly of the Beast later. We're really lucky to hear from her today, but we want to show you a glimpse early on of how Belly of the Beast is actively working to counter some of the lies by US media and politicians about Cuba. So we just have two short videos. One is called Why Cheap Chicken Obscures Costly Cuba Sanctions. And the other is an opportunity that Liz had to be actually at a press conference at the White House in the United States. Regarding the video about chicken, for anyone that's talks about the blockade with people in the United States or Canada internationally, people will often say, well, I saw US chicken, I saw this US product in Cuba, the blockade must not exist. Or perhaps folks have had the experience like some organizers here in Vancouver recently, where they were driving with a taxi driver in Cuba itself. And then that taxi driver said, well, US chicken is here, the blockade doesn't exist. And we can just see how pervasive the lies about Cuba are and how they even reach into Cuban society, of course, which is not immune, of course, to US capitalist major media. So we thought we would share those to start off, and then we'll get into our speakers. 1 second, I did not share the audio. Okay.
The Cuban regime is a cancer.
It's an illegitimate, terrorist, murderous regime in Cuba.
Cuba is unfortunately, a failed state.
US politicians love talking tough on Cuba, except when it comes to chicken.
66% of the chicken that's eaten in Cuba, which is the staple protein in Cuba, comes from the United States.
In the first 6 months of 2021, Cuba imported $123 million worth of chicken from the United States.
Chicken exports to Cuba are a talking point in Washington. The argument goes, if Cuba imports so much chicken from the US, then the embargo can't be that bad.
That's a terrible spin and, frankly, a disingenuous argument. We have restrictions on Cuba unlike any other country in the world. It's simply not fair, and it's certainly not in the interests of the United States. We represent about 100 national and state agricultural groups, farmers, producers, and companies. But one thing that they all agree on is they don't understand the present policy towards Cuba. It doesn't make any sense. While we are allowed to export food to Cuba, we can't offer credit terms, so we can only do it on a cash basis. 95% of what we export is poultry meat, because we can export poultry meat at a very affordable price. Price is so good that they don't need credit. So it makes sense for us to offer just cash terms and for Cuba to purchase it because it's so less expensive. But that's not true for every product. For example, rice exports, wheat, soybeans, and corn, animal feed. There's no home in the United States and no country in the world that can operate only on a cash basis. We operate on credit. But you're going to the store and you're buying your groceries, you're buying whatever goods you want, and you're putting most of that in a credit card so you can pay that 30 days down the road. Because you may not have the cash to pay for those goods that you need that very moment. It's the same way for countries. There's other barriers. One is the banking relationship. I can't go to my local bank the way I normally operate with every other country in the world. I have to go to a third country bank, which increases my costs. After 60 years, the only people who will continue to suffer are Cubans and American citizens. American citizens because they can't freely travel down here, they can't do more business on the island. That hurts Cuba's economy and ultimately hurts US exporters as well. And we're supposed to be helping civil society and the private sector. We're doing just the opposite. You can't tell me that it doesn't hurt if you cut off trade from the most powerful economy in the world that happens to be the most logical partner, which is 90 miles away. What Cuba ultimately wants is to have normalized relations with the United States. And normalized relations means we do this business the same way we do with other countries around the world. Policy as it is right now between the United States and Cuba goes through Miami. But we can't allow one state to determine the entire foreign policy of our country. We need to start turning to the other 49 states who have an interest in deepening our relations, rectifying past errors, moving forward, not only to help producers in the United States, but to help producers in Cuba.
That was the first video. I'm just going to bring up the other one.
What evidence is there that Cuba sponsored? What evidence is there that Cuba sponsored terrorism?
Well, the regime has a long track record of egregious human rights abuses, suppression of a free press, suppression of civil society, and other key factors that continue to keep them on that list.
But you can give me examples of terrorism
I'm going to work
because
the
that's
room a little
human
bit.
rights.
I'm going to work the room a little bit. Thank you. Jackson, go ahead.
So we can see how disgustingly quickly they shut Liz's question down and obviously had no answer, but very important that it was asked. So I'm looking forward to hearing from Liz directly. It's really great to have her with us here tonight. But I wanted, we are going to start with another special guest who some folks may have first been introduced to at the US-Cuba Normalization conference that took place in March of this year in New York City, Professor William LeoGrande, which is going to be introduced actually by Julie. Julie, go ahead.
All right, yes. It's an honor to have Professor LeoGrande here. He, as Allison said, works at the American University at Washington, D.C., co-authored The Back Channel to Cuba, Hidden History of Negotiations Between Washington and Havana, and has written many articles on US-Cuba relations, including Weaponizing Leaks, the Chinese Spy Base in Cuba, for Responsible Statecraft. So, Dr. LeoGrande, the mic is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me here this evening. It's important to understand that the information war on Cuba has been a component of US policy ever since President Eisenhower decided to overthrow the revolutionary government in 1959. We've already heard a little bit about the Chinese spy base. I want to say just a few words about that before I turn to a couple of other issues that I think are actually more important. There was a couple of weeks ago a set of coordinated leaks about a Chinese spy base and Chinese military training facility being built in Cuba. Now, the fact is there's been a small installation there for years. It may have been upgraded in 2018. But there's nothing new in 2023 to have caused this leak, except that it came right before Secretary of State Blinken's trip to China to try to reduce US-Chinese relations. So I think Cuba was really collateral damage here, but it triggered calls from some Republican members of Congress for airstrikes against the Chinese spy base in Cuba. And obviously leaks like this make it politically harder for people in the government and the Congress who want to see better US-Cuban relations. It makes it harder for them to advocate for that. And that's the point of leaks like this. But today I really want to focus on two more damaging lies about Cuba that are central to US policy and are targeting Cuba specifically. And we've already heard mention of them both. First, the claim that Cuba is a state sponsor of international terrorism. And second, that Cuba is engaged in human trafficking or modern slavery through its international medical programs. The terrorism list claim originated with Ronald Reagan. It was lifted by President Obama in 2015 as part of his effort to begin normalizing relations with Cuba. But it was reimposed by Donald Trump just before he left office. It's important to understand there is no factual basis at all to claim that Cuba is a sponsor of international terrorism. And all you have to look at is the Department of State's own country reports on international terrorism for this year to see that the only rationale that they offer is that Cuba is harboring some fugitives, political asylees from the United States. These are people who did engage, some of them, in politically motivated violence back in the 1970s. But their actions were not international terrorism by the statutory definition. And they have not engaged in any kind of terrorism since their arrival in Cuba. So even though Cuba is harboring those fugitives, it doesn't meet the statutory requirement to be listed as a state sponsor of international terrorism. Secretary of State Blinken told Colombian President Petro that the US, if it reviewed Cuba's standing on the list, the review would be based on the criteria in the law. But the Biden administration is refusing to undertake a review. So this false narrative has the effect of crippling Cuba's ability to conduct international financial transactions. And that is aggravating the humanitarian crisis that's on the island today, precisely because of Cuba's difficulty in importing the things, the food, the fuel, and medicine it needs to recover from COVID. The second issue is the claim that Cuba's programs of medical internationalism constitute human trafficking or modern slavery, as some people call it. Now, there's no doubt that some of these programs have had their problems. There has been the mistreatment of some volunteers by their supervisors. Some volunteers have been sent into dangerous working conditions without adequate safety standards. And there have been restrictions as a matter of policy placed on volunteers' movements during some of these missions. But the vast majority of Cuban medical personnel that volunteer for these missions do it out of a sense of altruism and out of and because it pays better than their salaries in Cuba, sometimes as much as 10 times better, because it's paid in hard currency by the country in which they serve. So to call this human trafficking is really an insult to the real victims of human trafficking around the world, including in the United States. This whole campaign against Cuban medical internationalism began about 13 years ago. It was promoted by conservative Republican Cuban Americans. And the reason was because medical internationalism programs were bringing in a significant amount of money for Cuba. Donald Trump, when he became president, put pressure on recipient countries to cancel the contracts that they had for medical services with Cuba. And the Biden administration has continued that pressure even today, even in the midst of COVID, as a matter of fact, when Cuba was sending medical teams abroad to help countries who didn't have the resources themselves to cope with the pandemic, to cope with it. So it's really important that we push back against these narratives because they do real damage to the standard of living of ordinary Cubans by contributing to the US strategy of trying to cut off all sources of finance to Cuba so that it can't afford to import fuel or food or the medicines that the Cuban people need. So I want to congratulate the organizers of today's webinar for focusing a spotlight on this particular component of US regime change policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, William LeoGrande, setting an example for under the amount of time, but providing excellent, important analysis and information. So thank you so much. As I said, we hope to have a fruitful discussion and question and answer period. So that's going to be great to have you for that. I'm sure folks have lots of important questions. So our next speaker is Liz, who we've already mentioned a few times today. Sorry, I just need to pull my notes this way. Liz Oliva Fernández is a 29-year-old award-winning Cuban journalist and producer with Belly of the Beast. She has won a Gracie Award and was co-winner of a One World Media Award for her work in presenting the documentary series, The War on Cuba, which I hope everyone is able to watch. Apart from her journalism and filmmaking, Liz is a dedicated anti-racist and feminist activist. I have not yet had the pleasure of meeting Liz. I really hope that will happen someday soon. But Liz, your work has made all the difference for us solidarity activists in the last few years, spreading the truth about Cuba, and it's really great to have you with us here today. So Liz, the floor is yours. I'm going to get the videos queued up and you just tell me what to do.
Yeah. Thank you, Alison. That's really nice presentation of myself. For me, well, I was listening to Professor Leo and I was thinking about the impact that these lies has in Cuban people. Because when you say a lie, you say, oh, okay, this is not really a big lie. They have some elements, some facts that they are true. But at the end, the damage that they lies to the Cuban people is huge. For example, Professor LeoGrande was talking about medical missions, and I was thinking about my mom. My mom went to the medical mission when I was like 11 years old. And for me, it's a really lack of this respect for her and for her word, and someone called her a slave or human traffic, that she's part of kind of human traffic, because the end of the goal of these medical missions are really, I know that sometimes for the United States and people who have lived their entire life, it's difficult to understand the humanity behind these missions, because they say, okay, what are you gain going to these places? Of course, Cuban doctors are not going to the most beautiful places in Brazil or Venezuela or in different part of Africa. They are going to difficult, far away, rural areas in this country, when people, the most probable thing is that they have been never ever seen a doctor in his entire life and never been treated. But well, this is only my story. I just want, Alisa, maybe this is better than I speak to talk about this, that I share with you a fragment of a video of Juan Jose. He's a Cuban medical doctor. He has been in several missions because he's part of a Henry Reef mission. I don't know, I don't show that in this fragment of the video, but his daughter, Talia, she's studying medicine because she wants to be like her dad. So no one can become a slave when he gets older. It's the opposite. So maybe can you share the video of the Juan Jesus, Alison?
I believe so. This should be right.
Around the world. In 2014, he fought Ebola in Liberia, West Africa.
Nos decía en la calle, ¿no? Ustedes están locos, se van a morir todos allá. La epidemia del ébola es una enfermedad muy letal y vamos asustados.
¿Por qué someterse a ese tipo de condiciones?
Por el afán de sentirse útil, sentir que salvaste una vida. Cada vez que pienso en que es probable que no me hayan pagado mucho, yo nada más que me acuerdo de las caras de las personas que se salvaron, ¿entiendes? Nosotros teníamos un niñito que se le murió a la familia entera y nosotros éramos su único sustento. Usted sabe la alegría de verlo a él todos los días vivo. Eso es como si te pagaran mucho dinero.
Cuba's international medical program began in 1960 when it sent a health brigade to Chile in response to a deadly earthquake. Since then, Cuba has sent more than 400,000 medical personnel to 164 countries. For decades, Cuba's medical missions were purely humanitarian. The government didn't charge a penny. Today, Cuba still sends thousands of doctors to poor countries in Africa and Latin America at no cost. But in the last 20 years, Cuba has also begun charging wealthier countries. Under some of these deals, Cuban doctors receive about 25% of what the host governments pay. About 75% goes to the state. The money pays for free healthcare in Cuba. 30,000 Cuban healthcare workers now serve on missions in 59 countries. Well, the video is longer than that, so you can check in our website in YouTube, in our page in YouTube, Oliva Beast Cuba. And also I want to talk about this list of the United States has about terrorism, that Cuba is sponsoring in some way terrorism that everyone knows that is a lie. But I'm pretty sure that the professor already mentioned, and I'm pretty sure that people are talking next to me are going to talk about that. I just want to address that there is not evidence that Cuba sponsored terrorism, the same way that there is no evidence that there is a Chinese spy base in Cuba. Do you remember the Havana syndrome? Do you remember how everyone was talking about microwave attack, Sony attack, whatever it calls this attack? So there never has been the evidence, and before that, the United States doesn't need evidence in his policy of operation to another country. You have to remember Iraq and the weapon of mass destructions. But for me, it's about that they work as a machine. So they create a lie, and they sell to the media outlets. The media about the lie and spread the lie around the world. That's the way that it works. And nobody's like fact checking, like it's the basis in journalists fact checking stories. Nobody's doing that. Because since when the United States policy of aggression depends on evidence? Never. That's the case of Cuba. That's the case of Havana syndrome. That's the case of terrorist list, and that's the case of doctors being part of human traffic or slave from the Cuban government. I also want, for the last, I just want to say, because I'm running out of time, Alison, the video about terrorism list, and that's all. I'm open to the question because I'm pretty sure that everybody's talking about the issues. And also remember that this is not only the big lies, it's also small lies. For example, I remember the case when the hurricane passed by Cuba, and there is like a few protests around the country. Everybody was talking about that, like a political, these people are angry against the government and asking for freedom. No, they are asking for electricity, water in their hands, because the situation at that time that was difficult enough to try to face it more crisis and more scarcities. So they took like a little fact, little sample, and they decontextualized the fact and became and bring with self like a lie and sell to the people, and the people buy it. And nobody's like trying to do real like a critical point of view when they saw news and when they read about Cuba. That's why when you talk about Cuba, the most of the people are going to say, okay, the regime, the dictatorship, or socialist, or Fidel, Varadero, Havana Club. This is the like keywords that people remember about Cuba, but there are more beyond that. But nobody's like taking the time to know more about my country and to spend the time like trying to do something against it. This is why this kind of webinar are so important for trying to show a part of the Cuban history.
In early January 2021, all eyes were on the US Capitol. Few people were paying attention to this guy. 9 days before Trump left office, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo named Cuba a state sponsor of terrorism.
Universally seen as a purely political move in order to leave a problem behind for the Biden people.
Being designated a state sponsor of terrorists is one of the most serious and harmful classifications that exist.
There's one big problem with naming Cuba a state sponsor of terrorism.
There's no evidence that Cuba is a state sponsor of terrorism.
That designation is it's an ugly symbol.
For Cubans, the designation is more than symbolic, it's hypocritical.
Cuba no es patrocinadora de ningún terrorismo en ninguna parte. Nosotros no somos terroristas, al contrario. Hemos recibido los ataques terroristas, sobre todo de Estados Unidos.
Las bombas que han puesto, los atentados que han hecho aquí en Cuba, fuera de Cuba, en sede diplomática, han sido ellos los que lo han patrocinado.
In 1976, former CIA operatives Luis Posada Carriles and Orlando Bosch masterminded a bomb attack on a Cuban civilian airliner. It was the deadliest terrorist attack in the Western Hemisphere until 9/11. All 73 people on board were killed, Both men later lived freely in Miami and were never prosecuted for their crime by US authorities. For decades, paramilitary groups planned and carried out terrorist attacks against Cuba from US soil. An Italian tourist was killed from one of 11 bombs placed at hotels in Havana in 1997. The bomber testified that Posada Carriles paid him to do it. In recent years, Cuban-American extremists in Florida have openly promoted armed attacks in Cuba on social media.
Tenemos que pagarle a cuanto la gente quiera cobrar por dar de candela a todas las patrullas, a todo lo que tenga que ver con el Estado. Le pagamos para que millones sean libres, tiene que morir 1 millón.
El camino es uno solo, guerra abierta, clandestina en Cuba.
Trump seemed unconcerned by armed groups in South Florida threatening violence. Instead, his administration came up with 3 reasons to justify calling Cuba a sponsor of terrorism. The first stemmed from Cuba's role as a mediator between Colombia's government and rebels considered terrorists by the US. For decades, Cuba has received praise internationally and in Colombia itself for being a state sponsor of peace, not terrorism. As Colombia resumes peace talks with the rebels, its president has urged Biden to take Cuba off the terrorism list.
Lo que estamos presenciando es una enorme injusticia internacional.
Trump's second reason for putting Cuba on the list was for harboring fugitives of US justice, like Assata Shakur.
It has harbored cop killers, hijackers, and terrorists.
I escaped, A, because I was afraid for my life, and B, because I knew that I would never receive justice.
Assata Shakur and other fugitives cited by the US were never convicted of committing acts of terrorism. And Cuba hasn't received a single US political exile in over 30 years. Finally, the Trump administration claimed that Cuba's support for Nicolas Maduro somehow encouraged terrorist activity in Venezuela. If this sounds far-fetched, it's because it is. No evidence was ever presented to back up the claim.
Le interesa sobre todo tener un pretexto más para continuar con el embargo.
Quiere perjudicarnos. Ese es el fin.
The state sponsor of terrorism designation is designed to devastate Cuba's economy.
It vindicates the decision of these banks to have pulled back and not have any contact with Cuba.
They won't touch it because Cuba's on the terrorist list. But they say, well, we just have a policy. We won't deal with any transaction involving a country on the list. The word terrorism is a powerfully emotive word. It's just extremely difficult to get out from under that.
In March 2021, Biden officials said they were open to reconsidering the designation.
And we're committed to carefully reviewing policy decisions made in the prior administration, including the decision to designate Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism.
Then again, 16 months later,
we are always examining the facts and applying them against the law.
And then again, last month,
we have clear laws, clear criteria, clear requirements, and we will continue as necessary to revisit those.
But so far, the Biden administration has kept Cuba on the list.
It would be very easy and relatively low cost to take Cuba off that list. It would take away an insult.
It's a process that's not very difficult. It's not rocket science, actually. If they have political will, they can very easily undo the damage that Trump had done with this list.
Okay, I think that's it for Liz. So Julie, the floor is yours.
Okay. All right. Well, those were wonderful videos, and thank you so much, Liz, for your insight. And hopefully there's people kind of like getting some questions prepared for a good discussion. So the next person that we have is Keith Bolender, who's an author and journalist in Canada, specializing Cuba-US relations. Keith's the author of 3 books on Cuba, including Voices from the Other Side, an oral history of terrorism against Cuba, and Manufacturing the Enemy, Media War Against Cuba. So it's my honor to introduce Keith to the guests here.
Thank you, Julie. It's great to be here. Welcome to everyone else, including the other panelists. Tonight I want to discuss excuse me, I'm fighting a cold, so my voice might be a little rough, and I may take all of William's 3 minutes that he didn't use. So hopefully I can get it under 10 minutes. Tonight I want to discuss the escalating lies against Cuba from a different angle, from my Canadian perspective. It's commonly accepted that American corporate media has been overwhelmingly anti-revolutionary since Fidel Castro's triumph in 1959. But what I want to discuss tonight is that the international corporate media can be just as bad, and I'm going to give some specific examples. One of the worst examples of biased media coverage of Cuba came from a well-respected Canadian newspaper following Fidel Castro's death in 2016. It came from the Toronto Star, Canada's largest circulation paper and recognized as usually left-leaning. It's a paper I worked on previously. They published an absolutely terrible piece by conservative columnist Rosie DiMano. In it, she basically insulted the entire Cuban population and anyone else who mourned one of the greatest statesmen of the 20th century. DiMano is more well recognized as a sports reporter. She denigrated the memory of Fidel and the gains of the revolution by sarcastically describing them as unworthy in a self-imposed value judgment that paid insult to an entire society. Very briefly, a quote from the article. Fidel provided free education and free healthcare, sent hundreds of physicians to war zones and disaster zones. His scientists invented vaccines for African diseases. Such a humanitarian. It doesn't balance out hardly. Instead, I'll drink to his demise, a Cuba Libre, a rum and coke concoction that actually predates the Castro era. And damn his eternal soul, she wrote. So in one stroke, DiMano dismissed all the social justice programs that have benefited millions of Cubans since the revolution, an accomplishment unheard of in any other developing country. As usual, there was no mention of American regime change policies or the effect it has on Cuban society, no mention of Fidel's commitment to internationalism, his assistance in bringing an end to apartheid in South Africa, or his support for the African nations she sneered at. Unfortunately, DiMano's example is just one that's still abound in Canadian media. Some recent reporting has come from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, our national broadcaster, another media outlet known internationally for its usually quality reporting of national and international affairs. Excuse me, this publicly funded corporation has surprisingly permitted a series of Cuban bashing reports from one of its senior reporters, Evan Dyer. Now, Dyer's been with the CBC for more than 20 years. He is right-wing. It's well known. He's a staunch supporter of Israel, consistently pro-Ukraine in the war with Russia, and he just last week did a hit piece on Mexican President Obrador. But it's his recent attacks on Cuba that have become increasingly disturbing, and I'll get into the reasons why the CBC is allowing this a little later. In the past year, there have been at least 4 anti-Cuban reports from Dyer, one aiming at convincing Canadian tourists not to go to Cuba. Yeah, good luck with that one. Canadian tourists are coming to Cuba regardless. In the post-COVID world, Canadians continue to be the nation sending the most tourists to the island. The vast majority do go to the beaches, mostly Veradero, as Cuba struggles to get back to the numbers of tourists they had before the pandemic shut down the country in 2021. The Canadians love the beaches, the safety, and the people of Cuba, so they will still continue to come. So anyway, Dyer is trying to convince Canadian tourists that they are supporting a despotic regime, that all the money they spend goes directly into the pockets of corrupt Cuban officials and nothing to the locals. It's ridiculous. Apparently, Dyer has never been to Cuba and knows nothing about how vital the tourist industry is to support the Cuban economy and its social programs, and how so many Cubans benefit economically from the direct interaction they have with the tourists. His piece on tourism came in 2021, just after the protests in Cuba. It was a one-sided article that ignored so much of the realities of how tourism helps the average Cuban. Not one Cuban who benefited from tourism was quoted. In fact, no one in Cuba was quoted. The headline revealed the biased angle of the story, how Canadian tourism sustains Cuba's army and one-party state. I'll quote very briefly. Standing on a street corner in Montreal, Ronaldo Rodriguez has a message for Canadians. Canadian tourists are feeding the Cuban regime, he told CBC News. Fellow protester Felix Blanco carried a sign that read, all-included resort in Cuba, 51% dictatorship, 49% foreign company, 0% Cuban people. Cuban Canadian activists say many Canadians are not aware of the extent to which the survival of Cuba's one-party regime depends upon the foreign currency tourists bring into the country, or the lengths the Cuban government will go to keep Canadians coming. End quote. There's so much to take apart from this litany of misinformation. There was no quotes from the Cuban government, no interviews with Cubans who benefit from the tourist industry, not just the resorts, but the ancillary businesses, including taxis and private restaurants. The article was written strictly from a point of view of some disgruntled Cubans living in Canada. Absolutely no recognition of the social programs Cuba still provides for everyone's benefit. So this narrative that Canadians shouldn't support tourism in Cuba was also on display when the Cuban Ministry of Tourism came to visit Canada last year. The same day, the Toronto Star inexplicably ran a misinformed article from a right-wing Cuban American living in Miami, spewing the same nonsense that Canadian tourists were not benefiting average Cubans. Now, if you want to make a political statement against an actual repressive regime, then just don't go to Florida. In May of this year, an article under Dyer's byline claimed that the Cuban government is trying to intimidate Cubans living in Canada. There was no evidence, just quotes from anti-revolutionaries residing in Montreal. The headline blared, quote, anti-regime activists in Canada accuse Cuba of using YouTube channel to intimidate them. And the story quoted very briefly, 13 Montrealers say they've been targeted by a campaign of harassment launched by the Cuban government to keep them from protesting against one-party rule on the island. A social media account which, according to a Cuban defector, is being run by Cuba's state security has been spreading detailed allegations against the 13 men, accusing them of trafficking cocaine from Colombia to Canada. Carlos Andredes says he's one of them. On March 21st, he arrived in his native Havana for a visit with his 95-year-old mother. Soon after arriving, Andrade says he was visited at his hotel by a woman in military uniform who gave him a piece of paper ordering him to present himself for an interview at a detention center operated by the Ministry of Interior. He was interrogated, he claimed, end quote. So the story contains no proof of the allegations, just quoting these anti-revolutionaries who have an obvious political agenda. There was no attempt to contact the Cuban government to get their side of the story. The article didn't even mention the social media account that was supposedly spreading these false rumors against these Cubans. Dyer seems only to be interested in interviewing angry Cubans who live in Canada, and that results in an extremely one-sided, biased reporting that the CBC should not be allowing. It tarnishes their reputation and just reinforces negative perspectives that do nothing but promote misinformation of a country that Canada has always maintained cordial relations with. So here's this small group of extreme opponents getting a tremendous amount of attention at the CBC on articles that provide no proof, just accusations and no comment from the Cuban side. That's not journalism, it's agenda-driven propaganda. So why? Why is the Canadian media promoting such biased anti-Cuban reporting, particularly now? So the CBC, the Toronto Star, they're ostensibly considered left-wing media outlets. They still represent corporate interests. They are the mainstream media here, and as such often reflect those capitalist values, especially regarding foreign relations. Canadian corporate media is owned in the majority by private interests, and those interests are as opposed to Cuba socialism as much as US media. Maybe not as overtly hostile, but that makes the bias even more effective as the Canadian consumer accepts the misinformation more readily as it's seen to be coming from the supposedly fair Canadian press. So Dyer and DeMano write about Cuba from the arrogance of ignorance. a far too typical attitude of international media. The two seem to know very little, if anything, about Cuban history, the revolution, its society, and the people who support the government despite the current challenges. There's never been any attempt to contextualize the US blockade and economic punishment Cuba has endured for decades. I don't even know if either one of them have ever been to Cuba. If they have, then their ignorance is even more telling, as it appears they've never talked to Cubans who may want change, but not from the demands of a foreign power. And the two sure don't have any knowledge about how the blockade affects the average Cuban on a daily basis and the difficulties it places on the Cuban government. Excuse me. So while the Canadian government has always maintained diplomatic relations with Havana, it has also consistently made clear its objections to the revolutionary government, making the same baseless complaints about Cuban human rights, lack of freedoms, and anti-democratic socialist constructs as the Americans do. Canada, we are a capitalist country, so by default, our government perceives Cuban society from that social economic lens, as does our corporate media. Maybe not as virulent as the American press, but still with a strong tendency to look for faults in Cuban society, real or imagined. American corporate media is outright hostile to Cuba. Canadian corporate media is more subtle in its objections, as reflected in its government and the media. So while the Canadian media and international press can and often is anti-revolutionary, we still can't let the US media off the hook for its long history of lies and biases, stretching back even before the revolution. And I'm going to take one really quick example. Nothing is off limits, not even during the worst early days of COVID, which William and others have mentioned. So this is in the early days of COVID, Cuba sent doctors to the first world country of Italy. Even that came under anti-revolutionary narratives in the US corporate media. Just one example of coverage of the Cuban doctors came from a March 2020 CNN story by Patrick Oppman. The headline question, quote, "Coronavirus hit countries are asking Cuba for medical help. Why is the US opposed?" Unquote. Well, the US is opposed because they are against anything positive that comes from Cuba, no matter the issue. That's not hard to figure out. The US has been doing it for 60 years, but apparently the media can't bring itself to acknowledge that basic truth, or more likely they agree that coverage should be aligned with America's policy of hostility against Havana. The wording of the headline implies that the American government has the legitimate reason to object to Cuba sending medical teams around the world to help fight COVID. So the average American consumer who doesn't know anything about Cuba except in negative terms already has assimilated this false narrative that there is some sort of legitimacy to objecting to Cuba's internationalism. This is before one word of the article is read. And then the story goes on to make the ridiculous claim of the doctors being slave laborers and all the other objections we've heard before. Standard anti-Cuban propaganda. There's so many other examples of American media taking an anti-Cuban stand, from Elian Gonzalez, the Cuban Five, the Sonic attacks, the protests. So many examples, which I obviously don't have the time to even mention anymore. So to wrap up, I just want to emphasize that media controls the narrative and how the public perceives the truth by what they do and what they don't report. When it comes to Cuba, the coverage is consistently biased and misinformed, portraying the revolutionary society in the worst possible way, no matter the subject. All of Cuba's economic ills are the fault of the system, so says the mainstream media. Unfortunately, these biases can also show up in the international media, as shown by these very few examples in the Canadian press. The mainstream press will continue to publish misinformed articles on Cuba because it fits easily into the capitalist narrative that Cuba is repressive, dictatorial, anti-democratic. What doesn't get reported is the American embargo and its negative effect on the economy and the nation's social programs, including the free health and education. or what the revolution has accomplished under these siege conditions. While Cuba is going through some really dramatic changes now with the legalization of the small, medium, and large companies, changing the dynamics between the state and private economy, along with the evolution of a new generation of Cubans who will shape the country's future, most of the international corporate media continues to be stuck in the same old biased, ill-informed storylines against the revolution. It's just even more discouraging when those biases are becoming more prevalent in the media outside of the USA. Our Canadian press should do better. Our Canadian press should know better. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Keith. I think you've sparked our first question, which is excellent, and maybe surprised a few people as well who are not living in Canada on this chat, who would be surprised about the really anti-Cuba rhetoric and yellow journalism that exists here in Canada, just like in the US. So thank you very much. So I'm going now to just make a quick donations pitch as Ambassador Yuri Gala gets ready. Wanted to say, if anyone is able to contribute to honorariums for our awesome translators, Julieta and Mercedes, any amount is much appreciated, and you can send the transfer to myself. Full transparency, of course. So this is through Zelle or through Cash App, or if you're in Canada, an e-transfer. All that information will be posted in the chat, and I really appreciate it. Of course, anything that goes over the amount that we may collect for translators would go right to the US-Cuba Normalization Conference Coalition, or any of the projects that we're going to announce later. Without further ado, as people continue to think of their questions, I am really excited to introduce the final panelist for tonight, who is Ambassador Yuri Gala Lopez. Again, really a big appreciation to all of Cuba's diplomatic team fighting every day, and also for the support during the March US-Cuba conference. It was really great to meet you all and have your presence. Ambassador Yuri Gala Lopez is Deputy Permanent Representative at Cuba's permanent mission to the United Nations. Gala Lopez previously served as the Cuban ambassador to Jamaica, as well as the Deputy Director for Humanitarian Affairs of the Directorate of Multilateral Affairs of Cuba's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So definitely experienced Cuban revolutionary and diplomat, and great to have your words close off our panel tonight. Ambassador Yuri Gala Lopez.
Thank you, and good evening to you all. Well, first, it is a privilege for me to be in this webinar representing the permanent mission of Cuba to the United Nations here in New York, and also allow me to express my appreciation to you, Alison, and to Tamara and other organizers of this important webinar. And I also appreciate the comments made by previous panelists of this webinar. Now, in terms of the topic at hand, allow me to start by saying that different US administrations have resorted to lies to justify their hostile actions against Cuba, as mentioned by previous panelists. In recent years, we have clearly seen the use of lies in the aggressive escalation of the US against Cuba. US governments have made unfounded accusations against Cuba, which are used as pretext to intensify the blockade and hostility against the island. The US government obviously is confident of its dominance over the media, and it is convinced that it has the capacity to deceive public opinion, especially that of its own country. However, it does not always succeed in doing that. For example, dozens of state legislatures, municipal councils, county boards, schools boards, and labor organizations, as well as other organizations representing civil society in the United States, have issued more than 90 resolutions against the economic blockade policy and in particular, more recently, calling for Cuba to be excluded from the arbitrary list of state sponsors of terrorism drawn up unilaterally by the State Department. By the way, one of those resolutions is the one recently passed by the New York City Council just some weeks ago. So New York City Council has joined others in denouncing and making the point about the need to lift the blockade and get Cuba off the list of the state sponsor of terrorism. Those cities here in the United States have joined the almost unanimous demand of the international community reflected every year here at the United Nations in the General Assembly and in the pronouncements of numerous regional organizations. But since the topic is basically, or more importantly, the lies, let me look at some examples of those lies. And first, let me use the topic of human rights. Human rights is one of the preferred areas for unfounded accusations against Cuba. Since the triumph of the Cuban Revolution in 1959, successive US governments have made allegations about the human rights situations in Cuba. Yet, Cuba has systematically rejected those allegations. The US government has no moral authority whatsoever to give lessons on human rights, much less to Cuba. When the US violates the right of the Cuban people to life, to development and peace by trying unconventional warfare schemes, including media and cybernetic operations to destabilize our country, and by intensifying, even in the context of pandemics and post-pandemics, the economic, commercial, and financial blockade imposed against Cuba for more than 6 decades. The second lie that I want to illustrate here is medical cooperation, as mentioned by some of the panelists before. So the US government has been accusing Cuba of alleged modern slavery and trafficking in persons who work in the Cuban health system for the purpose of exploitation. We have totally rejected those lies, yet under that approach, the US administrations have had the practice of pressuring governments in Africa, Asia, and Latin America to refuse medical cooperation from Cuba. Now, the objective is to discredit the Cuban Revolution on the one hand, and on the other hand, to deprive Cuba of financial resources necessary for the economy and for development. With its conduct and actions, the US government seeks to prevent medical services for tens of thousands of people, which is what Cuban doctors do. So it is immoral and unacceptable to question the dignity, professionalism, and altruism of the hundreds of thousands of Cuban health collaborators who over the last 6 decades have carried out missions in more than 160 nations. Now, you've mentioned at the beginning, Alison, that I served as diplomat in Jamaica. And at that country, we have witnessed the value of medical cooperation, and it is the case of other Caribbean nations which have received over the years medical cooperations as well. The outstanding contribution of the health collaborators from Cuba in the fight against Ebola in Africa, blindness in Latin America and the Caribbean, cholera in Haiti, and the participation of several brigades of the Henry Reeve International Contingent in a number of countries stand out. With the same selflessness and dedication, tens of thousands of health professionals from more than 130 countries have been trained in Cuba free of charge, and the ILAM in Cuba is a great example of that. The School of the Medical School of Latin America. So Cuban technicians and professionals who participate in these programs do so absolutely freely and voluntarily. Now, the third example that I want to bring is something that had been mentioned also, which is related to the inclusion of Cuba in the SSOT list. the state sponsors of terrorism list. It is known that in January 2021, days before the end of his term, the then President Donald Trump decided to reinclude Cuba in the said unilateral list. But the US government knows pretty well that the arguments used were dishonest. The main argument, by the way, was even already denounced by the current government of Colombia. So the US government knows the impact of this measure. And just to give you an example, a few weeks after the designation or redesignation of Cuba, more than 40 banks and financial institutions that had long-standing relationship with Cuba severed their ties with our country. This has an impact on our trade, on our possibilities for obtaining credit, on the ways to make payments, and other examples. It is a devastating impact. And even today, Cuba, by virtue of its presence on that list, is still encountering commercial and financial organizations that refuse to interact with Cuba for fear of reprisals from the US government. President Biden, by the way, since assuming the White House, could have removed Cuba from the SSOT list. The list to which Cuba does belong is the list of countries victims of terrorism perpetrated from the United States territory. So I have mentioned only 3 examples of unfounded accusations. In all 3 cases, these are lies against Cuba that seek to justify the said US policy of hostility, which experienced a clear escalation during the Trump administration with its so-called maximum pressure policy against my country, an approach that unfortunately is still in force today. It is known that the Cuban government has expressed its willingness to move towards a better understanding with the government of the United States and to foster civilized and cooperative relations based on mutual respect and without prejudice whatsoever to the sovereignty and independence of both countries. Now, in the meantime, we will continue to promote and facilitate the broadest possible ties with numerous sectors of the US that want to get closer to Cuba. Let me turn to the last aspect of my presentation here, which is the blockade. The fundamental and defining characteristic of the Cuba-US bilateral relationship continues to be the existence of the economic, financial, and commercial blockade imposed by the US as a weapon of cruel, immoral coercion, which constitutes the fundamental, and I reiterate, the fundamental obstacle to the performance of the Cuban economy. Also evident is the open policy of subversion and the attempts to destabilize our country with the backing of tens of millions of dollars, together with the tolerance towards those who, from the US territory, guide, finance, and even train individuals to commit violent acts against Cuba. The 60-year blockade also continues to be the main obstacle to progress in the bilateral relationship. But allow me to stress 4 points. First, the blockade is a clear design. The blockade is an inhumane policy and responds to a very clear design, which is not a new one, as mentioned here before. And for reference, just take a look at the memorandum of April 1960 issued by the then Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, Lester Mallory. Second point, the strengthening of the blockade. The blockade has been strengthened. It was deeply reinforced during the Trump administration. In those 4 years, more than 240 unilateral coercive measures were adopted against Cuba, some of them, by the way, of an unprecedented cruelty as part of its policy of maximum pressure, with the objective of suffocating sensitive sectors of the Cuban economy, such as fuel procurement, foreign trade, and tourism. And a significant number of those measures were adopted just when COVID-19 pandemic was more severely hitting Cuba. So they basically took on the pandemic as an ally in its unconventional war against Cuba and deliberately toughened the blockade. Most of those coercive measures remain in force and in full practical application under the current US administration. Third point, the impact. The human damage caused by the blockade cannot be measured. No Cuban family is spared from the effects of this inhumane policy. It is undeniable that it constitutes a flagrant and systematic violation of the human rights of the Cuban people and the major hindrance to the economic and social development of our country. So it continues to provoke material shortages and scarcity, to sow the seeds of discouragement and dissatisfaction, to harm the Cuban people and to impede economic growth at a time of serious global crisis. So the US blockade, and I want to emphasize that, is the root and stem of our economic hardships, most of them. And the fourth point is the denunciation at the United Nations here in New York. It has to be recalled that for 30 years, the United Nations General Assembly, is most representative and democratic body here, has adopted a text of a resolution on the necessity of ending the blockade imposed by the United States against Cuba. Again, for 30 years, 3 decades. Throughout those years, the number of countries voting in favor of this resolution has been increasing. The most recent exercise of that voting took place in November of last year, when 185 member states here voted in favor and only 2 voted against. So 185 countries cannot be wrong. The Cuba and those countries are on the right side of history here. Now, in closing, I like to point out the following. First, the weapons of the Cuban Revolution continue to be truth, ethics, humanism, and solidarity, and with them, we will continue to confront the hostility coming from the US, whose governments have not ceased at all in their efforts to impose their designs on Cuba. We know that in this struggle, we will be accompanied by many good people in the world who, no matter where they are in this planet, have never left us and will never leave us alone. It is neither legal nor ethical for the US government to subject a small nation like Cuba for decades to an unceasing economic war in order to impose on our country a political system and a government that are alien to it. Cuba makes efforts not only to survive, but also to continue to make headway in all possible areas. Rest assured that even though our road has not been and will not be easy, Cuba will not stop. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Yuri Gala Lopez. Excellent. I was just gonna jump in, Julie, and say if all the speakers want to turn on their cameras, we're getting towards the Q&A. So if you're available and can turn on your cameras, we'll probably also do a quick photo too. But go ahead, Julie.
Yeah, so I have some I want to do this real quickly because I know that we have a few questions that have come up, and I want to give people time to respond, but just a few quick announcements. One is, and I know Bob Schwartz is on this, attending this webinar. There is a fundraising campaign for Global Health Partners to purchase anesthesia machines for a trauma hospital in Havana. I will put the link to Global Health Partners in the chat. So it is a really good, it's an important humanitarian aid. And Bob, if you want to, add anything, else to the, about the campaign, you're more than welcome to do that. On October 13th and the 15th through the 15th, there's going to be a national meeting of the National Network on Cuba in Boston. And you can find out more information about that. I will, at the website for National Network on Cuba, I'll put that link in the chat as well. And I think that's really all for me as far as the announcements.
Sounds good. I got a few here too.
The other thing, well, the other thing to do, I'm sorry, Allison. The other thing is to just kind of keep in touch with US-Cuba normalization at the website. You guys have been there, just to keep up to date with what's going on in terms of actions and campaigns. That's it.
Excellent. Yeah, all that is going in the chat. We're getting some more questions for this excellent panel, which is great. So please feel free. We've caught a few in the chat, put them there or in the Q&A. I wanted to, coming off of what Julie said, the US-Cuba Normalization Conference Coalition meets every 2 weeks, and some of our initial main campaigns leading into the fall are going to be towards planning for October 6th actions, of course, marking the terrorist act of the bombing of the Air Cubana flight 455, which killed all passengers on board, carried out by anti-Cuban terrorists supported and sponsored by the United States. This is going to be an international period of action coming from a call from CARICOM, an Association of Caribbean States in the Americas. Very important. And also there's a film, a new film that a director is making available to us called Cuban Cubana 455. And so come to the meeting and you can find out more about that, as well as the organization of protests around the annual vote at the United Nations, where the world overwhelmingly comes out in support of Cuba against the US blockade at this UN vote. And there's protests often coordinated around the world, and US-Cuba Normalization Conference Coalition is a hub for those between the US, Canada, North America, and reaching out internationally. So if you want to plan those events, come to our next meeting. It will be this Sunday. We can put the information in the chat about how to get involved, and the website is going in the chat as well. The meetings are typically held every other Sunday at 4 p.m. Pacific time, 7 p.m. Eastern time. Also want to announce, we talked a bit about today about the state sponsors of terrorism. And this is a postcard campaign launched here in Vancouver from Friends of Cuba against the US blockade, but now supported internationally by organizations in the US, especially the co-launchers of the postcard with New York, New Jersey, Cuba-C. So get your copies of this postcard to Joe Biden, President Biden, calling on the Cuba to be removed from the list of state sponsors of terrorism immediately. We'd be glad to mail you any amount of postcards if you wish to join this campaign and distribute them in your area. You can email us at nobloqueovancouver@gmail.com to get involved. All the information about that campaign will go in the chat. And then also to announce a fundraising campaign called Jardín de Luz, a special aid to a special school for children with disabilities in Cuba. The Canadian Network on Cuba and the Asociación de Cubanos Juan Gilberto Gómez have announced this campaign to raise supplies for the school, which was hit by flooding. We'll put the information for how to make donations to this campaign in the chat, and I encourage people to do so if you're able to. Also to say, solidarity travel. Very important to go to Cuba, see it with your own eyes. One way to do so is the Calixto Garcia Solidarity Brigade, taking place from November 26th to December 8th, 2023. It is really an excellent opportunity to visit the eastern side of Cuba, and the Calixto Garcia Solidarity Brigade is working closely with ECAP to develop an exciting program. The program is ready. More information will be in the chat about how to join that. And lastly, just to encourage people, if you have events, there's lots of people from across the US and Canada and other countries here on the webinar. So please put the information for your local events and actions, what you're planning and organizing, give us ideas and inspiration, and perhaps connect with a few new folks. So that's what we're here for. So feel free to post in the chat itself. And I think we're ready for our first question. So we can start with the first question that came, which and a photo. Tamara here's telling me, remember about a photo. So if you have your cameras on, any speakers, make a smile and we'll do a group photo. But also to say, so our first question is what to make of the claim that Canadian diplomats were also affected by the sonic attacks in Havana. So Keith, this was a question to you. You could start us off, and then I'd invite anyone else who wants to comment about the sonic attacks lies to make comments there. And perhaps if we have time, we'll show another short video from Belly of the Beast. So
yeah, there was the fallout from the Canadian embassy in Havana. There was a claims that some of the diplomats there were affected under the same conditions as the Americans under the sonic attack syndrome. At that time, there was all sorts of speculation of what it was, a Russian secret weapon, crickets, fog machines, all sorts of things. But there was fallout as well, because the Canadian embassy sent back a few of its diplomats and reduced the staff for a short time. I'm not sure if it's fully staffed, but the whole sonic attack narrative in the media was again consistent with the anti-Cuban storylines, where it was without any proof, without any evidence, the media and the government put all the blame on the Cuban side, directly or indirectly, and it had quite a bit of political consequences to it. But yeah, the Canadian diplomats were affected, and I believe, maybe someone can verify this, that there were other reports from other embassies internationally that were experiencing the same sort of conditions. But there was all sorts of speculation that it was, one person was getting it and the other person was claiming that they were getting it the same way. So as the latest information was that it really wasn't anything that the media or the governments were claiming it was, but you didn't hear much of the end results of the story. It certainly was a lot of attention during the height of the sonic attacks. So yeah, there was political consequences from Canadian diplomats who apparently or were claiming that they were suffering from the same conditions.
I just want to add something. In Belly of the Beast, we did like extensive investigation about Havana syndrome. We have a full chapter about this topic. Everybody's agree that we are not saying that the diplomats, Canadians or US diplomats were lying. We say, okay, the symptoms are real. So you feel dizziness or you feel nauseous or whatever. But scientists say that the cause is different to the symptoms. Okay, what is the cause? Microwave weapons? No, it's false, it's fake, it's a lie. Russia spying Cuba is another lie. So scientists have explanations where that say that why these people feeling in that way. They have like a different theories about that. In fact, US has a really good report called the Jason report, and nobody's talking about that, that explain in details what could be the possible causes of the symptoms of these diplomats. But one thing is for sure, I said the cause is not the cause that the media outlets are saying that this is a kind of weapon that Cuba or Russia or China or whatever is attacking US or Canadian diplomats.
Did anyone else want to add anything about the Havana syndrome? Okay, so Julie, you've got the next question.
All right, so we have a question from Steve, says, Dr. LeoGrande, the ambassador, and Liz. Scientific Marxists believe that ultimately it's impossible to have socialism in one country any more than you could maintain one local union against a mega corporation. Things have been hard in Cuba the last couple of years. How long do you think Cuba can hold out without workers' upsurges and even more revolutions in other countries? cannot hold on forever without that. How long can Cuba hold on, and how can we help?
Well, I'll give it a start. Well, Cuba has managed to hold on for 60 years, and more than 60 now. And even with the demise of the Soviet Union and socialism in Europe generally, Cuba survived the special period when a lot of people didn't think that it would. It's surviving now in an extremely difficult situation. And I think that's a testimony to the determination of the Cuban people to maintain their national sovereignty and their independence. Cuba has a lot of friends around the world, even not socialist countries. There's a lot of countries in the world that, unlike the United States, have recognized that having a good relationship with Cuba is in their national interest, even though Cuba may have a different social system than they do. And so, I think that I'd like to be optimistic. I think in the long run that, in fact, even the United States will eventually come to its senses, as it almost did during the Obama administration. And that eventually we will have a constructive and more normal relationship between Cuba and the United States, or as Raul Castro said, a civilized relationship based upon mutual respect.
Ambassador, or anybody actually want to respond?
Yes, if I may, yes. Well, just quickly, 2 points. In terms of Cuba's determination to resist, but not only to resist, but to also move forward in our development, I think it's quite clear that we have resisted for over 60 years, and the determination is there by the majority of the population to continue moving forward in our model of country, which enjoys consensus there. And I think it would be difficult for any other country to really resist the type of attacks that we are getting from successive US administration in terms of the blockade and subversive plans, if we did not enjoy a firm level of support in our country. I mean, being so close to the United States, only 90 miles off, it'll be difficult for any country to resist that if the nation does not enjoy an important level of support from its own population. On the other hand, in terms of the international support to Cuba as a nation, I think there are a number of examples. We have diplomatic relations with many countries in the world. We have embassies in many countries in the world. The diplomatic community in Cuba has a presence there of more than 100 embassies represented there. And the example that I used in my initial comments in terms of the level of support that the traditional resolution against the blockade adopted at the United Nations General Assembly is also an important example of the level of support that Cuba enjoys internationally. I mean, that resolution has been adopted just recently with the positive vote of 185 countries, meaning that a number of allies from the United States are also voted in favor of the traditional Cuban resolution. So that's something that shows that there is an overwhelming support to the Cuban claim that the blockade has to be lifted, even though most of those countries may have, and actually they have different social systems, political system, economic system, yet they do support Cuba in that claim, at the international forum.
Any other takers on this question? Otherwise, we'll move on to another question.
Okay, I think we'll go to the next. So the next question is around Cuba's medical internationalism. Specifically, their has been, of course, the meeting of BRICS. Perhaps we could also add to this question other, south to south, as they're sometimes called, economic agreements, such as ALBA, such as CELAC, agreements between countries that work outside of the sphere of the United States government. So the question is around the expansion of medical internationalism through these newer types of economic agreements, such as BRICS. Someone's just wondering if this is a possibility, this is being discussed, and any other opportunities that people see, or that any of our panelists see, regarding the expansion of Cuba's medical internationalism today. Does anyone have any initial answer? Ambassador Urigala, I'm kind of looking at you, if you had any perspective on this to share.
Well, as mentioned in my comments, I think medical cooperation, internationalism for Cuba is something that is embedded in our, I would say, social fabric. We have been present in a number of countries, especially in developing countries, for many years. And I think that here in our region, I have a number of examples in which Cuban health collaborators were there in difficult conditions because of, the situation present in those countries. One should recall, for example, the earthquake that hit Haiti back in 2010. And we actually had people over there, collaborators, and when the earthquake happened, there was a decision by Cuba to send more collaborators to try to help the difficult situations in Haiti under, as the result of the earthquake. When cholera also hit Haiti, we had a presence there of, a medical brigade with a number of health collaborators. So there has been a number of examples over the years in which Cuba has proven that can be a partner when it comes to providing support to other developing countries based on the, the issue of South-South cooperation. And that is something that we support, we defend, we promote. We have been also a recipient of South cooperations as well. So it's something that we are in a position to continue giving, even though we obviously have limited resources. Because let me tell you, when it comes to Cuba, it's not about giving others what we have to spare, but to modestly sharing the little resources that we have.
I just wanted to say something quick about that. The ambassador reminded me of the Haiti situation. The Cuban medical teams had been in Haiti for months after the hurricane hit. The Americans sent some medical teams there, and the national media was like, oh, look how wonderful the Americans are sending these medical teams to help the poor Haitians. But meanwhile, the Cubans have been there for months and months and months. And how much coverage did they get? If I remember correctly, nothing. And this is how the media manipulates not only what they do write about, but what they don't write about. And it's the lack of information, the lack of knowledge that can be just as damaging as the blatant misinformation. So I just wanted to comment on that when the ambassador mentioned the medical teams in Haiti.
All right. So thank you, Keith. We're gonna move to the next question here from Marianne. How can we encourage NGOs to more openly acknowledge amazing contribution Cuban doctors have made with their medical internationalism? We kind of talked about that. And other ideas of how to line up more non-governmental allies. I don't know if I mean, I can just say, just in terms of doing solidarity work in Chicago, it's kind of a it's just a matter of like talking to people and looking for people who are kind of like receptive and open to talking about Cuba, and people on picket lines, people who are at demonstrating around issues of First Amendment rights. I mean, people that you work with is always a good place to talk about building solidarity and joining the various campaigns that are out there. I don't know that there's a magic kind of pill to this, but I think the important thing is that understanding that there's interest out there, and what I see, I think what we're all seeing is that there's a growing, increasing receptivity to doing something to end, to formalize an end to the blockade of Cuba. And that's why we're seeing as many resolutions that have been passed, over 90 some resolutions that have been passed. I think this is an indication of the sentiment that we just need to kind of organize and get people involved. I don't know, Tamara or Allison, do you have any thoughts? Because
I think that's like a good start. I mean, I definitely encourage people to post in the chat. I think being active, consistent, and out in the streets is, as well as online, is what we need to do more of to reach other partners in this work for Cuba. But I'm going to jump in because Liz is going to have to leave. It's getting late and she needs to get headed home. But Liz, I just wanted to ask if there was any final comments you wanted to share before you leave here tonight.
Thank you, Allison. I just thinking about that, encourage everybody to think critical about Cuba. Every news that you receive, every report that you read, please be critical about who is getting benefits from this, and who is getting something from this article, and why these people are writing about this topic or another, because it's so easy to have like a misunderstanding information about Cuba and what's really happening. And also, if you're not coming to Cuba, please visit us, come in Cuba, and in that way you can see and touch with your own hands what is Cuba looks like.
Thank you so much, Liz Oliva Fernández, for your time, your work that is daily, that is constant in support of Cuba against this criminal blockade and breaking down the media lies and disinformation. It's really great to have you here today. And we'll put all the links in the chat again, but Belly of the Beast, look it up, follow, share constantly. We have to work as well as we can to break the lies against Cuba. And unfortunately, CNN, major imperialist capitalist media, still has millions of dollars, billions of dollars more than we ever will, but we've got the heart and we've got the dedication. So thank you, Liz. We'll see you soon.
Yes. Allison?
Yes, of course.
Yes. Just to jumping into the issue of NGOs and their role, perhaps in helping, in terms of exposing the lies here against Cuba. And I think that's something that would be helpful. I mean, for those persons who wants to really get into the facts, including NGOs, just to look into, the objective information in order to contribute to trying to expose the lies which are carried out against Cuba. Just some minutes ago, somebody mentioned the issue of the so-called sonic attacks. And the truth, for example, is that until today, the United States government has not shown any scientific evidence that there has been any event or incident in Cuba capable of explaining the reports about health conditions of its diplomats back then. That was in 2017, by the way. And so more than some years since that started. And the result of that kind of allegations against Cuba were very complicated. On the one hand, people will recall that the consular services at the US Embassy in Havana were shut down. And people who wanted to do certain consular services residing in Cuba had to actually fly to a third country to make those, requests for immigrant visas to the United States, even for temporal visits or family visits to the United States. An individual had to go to a third country with the implications of that in terms of the financial impact of that kind of travel to a third country, and even some other complicated conditions as well. So no consular services for a number of years. Even the number of diplomats from Cuba were reduced in Washington, D.C. And there were other measures related to that issue of the so-called incident attacks. So that's an example of the implications of a lie that is not explained, scientifically speaking, but in any case have produced a very negative impact on a country such as Cuba.
Thank you, Ambassador Yuri Gala Lopez. I'll give my short warning to the speakers to say, we'll do one more question and then we'll do our wrap up. Really excellent keeping this within 2 hours. I appreciate everybody. So the final question we thought to ask tonight is if folks could please elaborate on the NED, USAID, Republican Institute, etc., getting money into, the question is coming from someone in Canada, so getting money into the media here in Canada, but at all of these offices, NED, USAID, Republican Institute, are also fomenting and funding many other anti-Cuba programs. So if anyone has any comments they'd like to share about that side of things, but Keith, if you want to kick us off, someone's wondering specifically about the Canada angle.
So this conference is going to go for a lot more than 2 hours if we get into this. USAID, NED, wow, there's such a long history, and I'll certainly defer to William to give more specific details. As far as Canadian NED, USAID programs affecting Canadian media regarding anti-Cuba biases, I'm not sure. I don't think I can address that directly because I'm not sure of any. USAID and NED are more connected to outside of North American countries, developing nations, where they go in and under the guise of American democracy programs provide funding and social assistance with certain strings attached. There's millions and millions and millions of dollars that have been spent through NED, USAID to help regime change strategies under various US programs that have been documented on the internet, but mostly outside of Cuba. So American think tanks, American experts, Cuban American experts will receive all this funding from USAID and NED to study Cuban society and how to change it, how to finally convince these stubborn Cubans to give up the revolution, which so far they haven't been able to for 60 years. So it's a big industry in the United States, financially lucrative for a lot of people, but again, as far as I can see, it doesn't have much effect on the goals. No more effect that the blockade for 60 years has had on the stated American goals. But as far as NED, if I understand the question correctly, NED, USAID directly involved in Canadian media, I have no evidence of that. And if the questionnaire, if the person who posed that question has, I'd be more than happy to hear it or find more about it. But the whole USAID, NED topic, we could be going on for a long while, I'm assuming.
You know that back in 2016, Russia spent a few $1 million on social media in the United States, trying to interfere in the United States election. And it caused outrage in the United States, absolute outrage, rightly so, rightly so. The United States spends $30 million a year on the same kind of programs to influence the internal politics of Cuba. It spends it on dissident organizations in Cuba. It spends it in direct personal support for opponents of the government. And it spends an enormous amount to support various media outlets that publish critical articles about Cuba, some based in the United States and some based in Cuba itself. And I will say, I think that that's probably just the tip of the iceberg. You also have TV and Radio Marti broadcasts. You have, and this is all not through the intelligence community. This is all through these democracy promotion institutions. One has to assume there's probably yet another budget, covert, that's being carried out in tandem by the intelligence community. So there has been an active effort on the part of the United States to undermine, subvert the Cuban government, literally since mid-1959, and it has never stopped.
Sorry, William, is Radio Marti under the budgetary auspices of USAID or NED? Or is it a separate?
Well, there's a separate Cuban Office of Cuban Broadcasting.
Right.
Right.
Do they draw the budget from USAID?
No, they get their own budget. They get their own line item in the foreign operations budget every year.
So there's layers upon layers of.
Exactly.
All right, so we're at the end of our webinar, and we want to give everybody, the remaining speakers, a few minutes to kind of just do a last minute kind of summary, 3 minutes or so. So, Keith, you want to start?
Sure. Again, thank you for inviting me to speak, and I've really enjoyed it. I guess I want to end up, the mainstream media is such a monolithic institution. It's really hard to penetrate the gatekeepers when they create narratives. And in Cuba, this narrative of Cuba has been going on since well before the revolution. American foreign policy has been very specific regarding Cuba when it was a Spanish colony, when American hegemony was established, right through the revolution. And American media has, for the majority, followed in lockstep with American foreign policy objectives against Cuba. So this is nothing new. It's just in context of the American politicians and the media have had for the last 6 decades the excuse of Cuban socialism, Cuban communism, and the threat it posed 90 miles off its border as an excuse to maintain these biases and misinformation and outright hostility. So people always ask me, well, what can you do against the mainstream media? It's in Canada and the United States and internationally, it's really a challenge because it's pretty consistent, the anti-Cuban biases. Now, the fortunate thing is we live in a society where we have the social media, and that's advantages and disadvantages. So this webinar connects with like-minded people about Cuba, but more importantly, hopefully the information will get out to people who don't know the Cuban society, the Cuban history, the Cuban Revolution, and what it actually is involved. And that's as important, if not more important, than what we're doing tonight. We're the conduit, but it's getting into people who may not know. And I'll use the example of, we're talking about the people here, the Vancouver groups. They don't go to Cuba as tourists. They have specific agendas. They bring people. They expose Canadians and others to Cuba beyond tourism. But I have talked to many Canadian tourists who consistently say, oh, I've been to Cuba 10, 20 times. Oh, where'd you go? Veradero. Same hotel, same place, same people, which is fine, which is absolutely fine. but it's those the average Canadian, and certainly more than that, the average American, who needs to know the expanded version of Cuba than just the tourism perspective. Its history, its people, its society, why the revolution is still maintained despite the difficulties the people are going through right now, all the challenges the revolution and Cuban society is facing, and still this support at the groundworks level. So it's important to get out there, write letters to the mainstream media if you want. It's going to be very difficult. Connect with the alternative media, connect with your Facebook pages, connect with webinars like this, and hopefully get the message that Cuba is not how it's being portrayed in the corporate media, the consistency, the biases, the misinformation, the outright lies. So hard to overcome, so hard to penetrate, but is so necessary, particularly in this really challenging time that the Cuban government and the Cuban people are facing. But these webinars are so important, and hopefully we can expand it from here.
Thank you, Keith. Dr. LeoGrande, do you want to say a final remarks?
Just a couple of final remarks. You know, I know that this mountain of misinformation about Cuba can seem really daunting and difficult to penetrate. But I firmly believe that if enough people keep chipping away at it and creating little pebbles, a lot of little pebbles can cause an avalanche and finally get a change in US policy. So I would just say to everybody out there, keep chipping away.
All right, chipping away, and we're going to go to Ambassador Yuri. Final remarks.
Well, I've been talking a little bit here, but I just wanted to lead my final comments just to really express our appreciation to you for hosting such an important webinar. I think this is something that contributes to really, fight misinformation. It's a challenge because of what had been explained here in terms of corporate media and some other outlets out there. But in any case, efforts such as this one will definitely contribute to share objective information to a number of people who are interested in getting more information about Cuba, get closer to the real Cuba. So thank you for these efforts, which contribute to really expose the unfounded accusations and arbitrary accusations against Cuba. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Allison, you got final, I don't know, Ike has his hand up. I don't know if that's a mistake or what there.
We'll ask him. Ike, would you like to say anything at the end? Oh, hand down maybe, or figuring it out?
No, I'm just enjoying the wonderful webinar.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much to Julie for co-hosting tonight, to our excellent speakers, really a distinguished panel of Professor William LeoGrande, Liz Oliva Fernández from Belly of the Beast, direct from Cuba, Keith Bolender, and Ambassador Yuri Gala Lopez. I want to mention that in the chat, we did put the links to both of the most recent, probably, I believe, books from Professor William LeoGrande and Keith Bolender. Please get their books and support them that way and read more. Also, if anyone wants to join the next meeting of the US-Cuba International Conference Coalition, we meet on Sunday at 4 p.m. Pacific time, 7 p.m. Eastern time. If you put your email in the chat or send me a message, John Waller posted earlier that we would make sure to get you that meeting invite, and it's true, we will. So feel free to send that on. And again, another just quick brief for the postcard: Cuba off the list of state sponsors of terrorism. Get your postcards. The email for that is in the chat, noblockeo.vancouver@gmail.com. And really a fruitful discussion tonight. So grateful for everybody's time, everyone for posting in the chat, all the supportive comments really across North America and a few European countries I'm seeing as well. Let's continue building this broad, united movement against the US blockade on Cuba. Let's continue fighting against Cuba's presence on the list of state sponsors of terrorism and continue our organizing together. Lift the blockade on Cuba now. And would be amiss to not thank Julieta and Mercedes for your excellent translation tonight. So appreciated. Viva Cuba.
Okay,
Viva.
thank you.
Viva Cuba. Viva Cuba.
Thank you all.
Viva Cuba.
Viva Cuba.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Good night,
Allison. Thank you,
everybody.
Tamara.
Thank you.
guys.
Excellent
Good to
job.
see everyone.
Chicago to Vancouver, here we go. Viva Cuba.
Viva.
Viva.